The information shared in this podcast and related media is intended to provide broad consumer understanding and knowledge of healthcare topics as they pertain to remote work. All content herein is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Further, this information should not be used in place of a visit, call, consultation, or advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. The owners of this content do not recommend the self-management of health problems. Should you have any healthcare-related questions, please call or see your physician or other healthcare provider promptly. You should never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard on this podcast or read in related media. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor, seek professional help, or call 911 immediately.
Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the TeammateApart Podcast Mental Health Series. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. The purpose of this series is to destigmatize the mental health issues commonly found in the remote work community. We have partnered with doctors, therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals for a series of in-depth discussions on a broad range of topics, ranging from isolation and depression to crafting meaningful relationships with others, and maybe more importantly, with ourselves. Our guest experts will share their insights in order to arm teams and leaders with the tools they need to thrive now and in the future. Mental health has always been a relevant issue for remote workers, freelancers, and distributed teams. But in today's climate, the subject is becoming more and more pertinent each and every day. I look forward to sharing this valuable information with you, and please join the conversation online, on the socials, or wherever the audience most suited to hear it can get involved. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by TeammateApart.com. TeammateApart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, TeammateApart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammateapart.com/crisis to not only download your free TeammateApart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammateapart.com/crisis, that is teammateapart.com/crisis, to download your free best practices guide. Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Today on the TeammateApart Podcast Mental Health Series, we have special guest Victoria Rivera. Victoria is a wellness psychotherapist in New York City, where she provides holistically oriented treatment to New Yorkers who are type A personalities with high-functioning anxiety and who struggle with self-care and finding meaning in their lives. Victoria began her career in social work at a day treatment program in the Bronx and then at a community mental health clinic for more than 12 years, providing individual and group psychotherapy. In that time, she continued her education, completing NYU's Institute for Psychoanalytic Education Program, Adult Psychodynamic Psychotherapy Program, certification in Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, and the Institute for Integrative Nutrition's Health Coaching Certification Program. Here for a deep dive on the 9 dimensions of wellness, recognizing burnout and how to deal with it, the role of diet in our mental health, meditation, and so much more, join me in welcoming our guest, Victoria Rivera. Hey Victoria, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm fine. How are you?
So good, so good. Well, weathering the storm as we can with all the COVID stuff going on out there.
Yeah.
So let's kind of kick this thing off from the beginning. You are a wellness psychotherapist. Let's talk a little bit about what that even means and how you get into a field like this.
So, I made up the term wellness psychotherapist because part of my journey in terms of health and wellness is really holistically kind of looking at ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our brains, and coming up with some ways that are practical, but also focused on how we think, and most importantly, kind of how we feel. Because our feelings, we do know, actually drive our behavior and drive our thinking. So the psychotherapist part came from, I was in college, loved psychology. I started taking psychology classes, and I actually thought I wanted to be a medical doctor, but I ended up getting into psychology. And then I went to India, and just very briefly, like that just kind of shifted my whole perspective on the world and on life and social issues. So then I got my master's at Columbia University in social work. And then from there, I started working in mental health and have been a psychotherapist ever since.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's funny. There's sort of a parallel there. So I haven't been to India. However, I went to Spain about 6 years ago. And for me, the relationships and the way that people interacted with me, and sort of, there were a lot of dynamics there that were really impactful for me. So many people go to Spain and it's all about the party or the food or the whatever. But for me, it was all about the relationships and sort of about the way that people treated one another and the value they put on sort of their relationships, like there's nothing more important to them. And I had worked basically the prior 20 years for myself, working for myself, nose down in an office. Many of my friends and relationships and things had sort of, flittered off, and people went to school and got married and did whatever. And so, I didn't even really realize I was alone until I was alone. And then when I had this opportunity to go to Spain, it changed my whole paradigm. It was a massive shift. And so about 6 years ago, we started really working on this relationship stuff. And just to give a little bit of background for the people who are tuning into this show, but obviously not privy to the 2 minutes of conversation we had prior to the show, I was just explaining to Victoria that, so much of the work we do at TeammateApart is in and around, developing human relationships. But for me, that's where it comes from. So it's really cool that this experience in India sort of helped steer your ship or sort of put you on a path.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's what makes like going to different countries so impactful, and it helps you to kind of reorient and learn what you may have learned. And epiphany just now, I didn't even really think about this, but I'm mixed race. So my father's from Puerto Rico. So a lot of Spanish influence. And my mother is American from upstate New York. And the difference between the cultures and connection is pretty evident in many ways. So like in Spain, very like loving and caring and open and, wanting to connect and well, maybe my mom's family is just different. I don't know. But in terms of American culture, it's just not as prominent, and I noticed the difference. And so that's probably why when I was in India, I really connected to the culture there, because it's very similar, very family oriented, loving, open, maybe sometimes a little too into your business. I can imagine, but there's something very important about that and special that I think sometimes, growing up in the US, we may not have that same kind of camaraderie and connection.
Yeah. And that's something I try to point out, right? I mean, I was born and raised here too, so it's like, I try to be sensitive to the fact that, we're Americans, and of course we have meaningful relationships here. And of course people have great families, and of course all that stuff exists, right? Even myself, it was just myself and my mother growing up, but I mean, I never didn't feel loved, right? Like I always felt like I had a family, and I always felt good about that. And so, but there's something different about it. It's this intangible quality, and I can't even articulate it very well. But for me, it was so much like, this first trip that I ever made out there, I didn't speak the language. I had made a relationship with a friend from there. And so I'd gone over to spend time with her. And the way that I was sort of drug into her social groups and drug into her familial circles and all this stuff, even though I didn't speak a lick of Spanish, I didn't understand anything, and they don't speak great English over in Spain. Like none of that mattered. It was like we were old friends, and I was being included in everything. And for whatever reason, maybe it was just the right time, right moment in life, maybe, and I was finally ready to hear it or see it or accept it or whatever. But for me, it was just wildly impactful. And there's something that I've been chasing ever since, trying to figure out how to build that into our businesses and into our life and everything else. So I think it's a really cool thing.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I mean, we co-regulate with each other. That's what it is. So that intangible feeling or experience that you're thinking about and feeling is the co-regulation that we have, not just with the people that are close to us, but the people around us, even in like the next door office that we might not talk to or connect with, the security guard. I mean, people walking down the street, there is a connection energetically. And I know that sounds really woo-woo, but I have totally felt the difference between doing virtual visits with patients and working with them in therapy to working with them in person. There is an energy that is just not, it's just not the same.
I think it's so true. And I think anybody who's being sort of intellectually honest will say that they know what that is. They can feel this thing. You know, they may not be totally spiritual. They may not be totally whatever, but I know that this is a human experience and that they can say, you know, I mean, to some extent, you know, you can sense danger. You can tell when you're getting daggers from across the room. You could, you know, I don't know what that is, you know, whether it's a spiritual thing or it's a, you know, spidey sense thing, or I don't know what it is, but there's definitely something going on there that's very human. And so it's interesting that you bring up, you know, the difference in seeing your clients in person versus seeing them via Zoom or whatever, like what we're doing. I always use this metaphor for like sort of virtual communication as we do in the remote workspace as sort of, you know, as it pertains to filling a glass of water for the purpose of staying satiated. So, you know, you can send text messages back and forth and, you know, it's a communication and you're talking, but it's like a drop at a time in the glass, right? And, you know, then maybe you get an email and you can email back and forth and that's nice and everything, but maybe that's, I don't know, a quarter cup of water or something, you know, or an instant message or a Slack or whatever. You know, they're all little increments of water, right? And for some people, they really like video conference and things like that. I think it's pretty great. But for me, video conference is, let's say it's 90% of a glass of water, right? It's enough to stay alive, but it's not totally fulfilling. But getting together in person over a cup of coffee, or in your case, you know, on the couch, you know, that in-person connection, there's just something so different about it. Being able to read the body language, being able to see, you know, look into people's eyes, those sorts of things, you know, those are the intangible qualities that Zoom can't capture, at least not yet. And, you know, and I think that that's really the difference, you know, so yes, we can stay alive through these other means of communication, but we're not really thriving, you know, we're not totally satiated until we have time to meet with people in person.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And there's research about like co-regulation, you know, with like infants that are 6 months old and a mother, their level of stress hormones are equal. So, you know, they're not necessarily, you know, they're not like merged together, but there is a co-regulation that happens. And then there's like mirror neurons, which, you know, we talk a lot about in psychology and understanding like how to kind of connect with people. We have micro expressions that we're not even consciously aware of that we're doing, body movements, all of these things that just unfortunately we can't capture virtually. And there's really something very missing, missing in all of that.
Well, so maybe let's shift the conversation a little bit, and you can tell me if you agree with this or not. I mean, I'm certainly don't have the kind of training you do, but my feeling is, my gut is that in order for us to really connect as people and to begin to develop relationships, you know, especially meaningful ones, it's important that we sort of start maybe with ourselves a little bit and sort of work on some fundamental things within ourselves to try and be, I guess, sort of capable of receiving this. I equate it to the, you know, when you're on an airplane and the oxygen mask drops, you're supposed to put it on yourself first before you put it on your child. And it feels counterintuitive because you're going, no, I must rescue my child. But the fact of the matter is you're no good to them dead. And so the idea is, you know, that maybe we need to take care of self prior to taking care of other people, not to diminish the care that we give others, but, you know, we're maybe not completely set up to do the work if we don't do it or, you know, take it on ourselves first. So I wondered if you talk a little bit about just sort of like self-care, sort of the different components of self-care. And I think you talk a little bit about sort of these 9 dimensions of wellness. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if we could maybe get into that a little bit, because that might lay sort of some fundamental information for sort of the rest of this conversation.
Sure. No, that's great. It's a great segue. So the first 3 that I'll talk about is physical wellness. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is emotional wellness. And the third, in my opinion, that's important, is spiritual. So physical, like, if we don't have our health, we really don't have anything. And our bodies are made to basically survive for however long we live, right? And so in order to be able to understand any of these other dimensions of wellness, or how we think, how we feel, any of that, we have to be physically taking care of ourselves. And I think that's where, you know, when you talk about self-care and how people will end up putting the mask on their child before themselves, that's even though it's counterintuitive to do that, that's exactly what we should be doing, because in and of itself, like if we don't have our physical health, then we're not able to be good to anybody, let alone ourselves, let alone like, the people that we love and care about. So when I talk about health, physical health, I break it down even further to sleep being like the foundation. There's so much research, Ryan, on sleep, and there's this idea of getting only 4 hours of sleep or 3 hours of sleep and powering through things has really, it's been such a disservice to us as human beings and to our bodies. We need sleep in order to rejuvenate, to clear our minds. There's so many things biologically that are happening while we're sleeping that we have no idea about even now. Dreams sometimes, also release some unconscious stuff, so that helps with the emotional wellness. But in terms of sleep, I mean, we know now it's 7 to 9 hours is the optimal. And there are very, very few people who can survive on any less than that. And then, so sleep is the foundation. So getting that in order first and foremost, which is a real challenge for a lot of people, and especially when, quarantine happened and I would imagine also too, people working remotely or not going into the office, and like just this whole shift in our circadian rhythms because of we're not doing the same like structure or pattern. Our sleep definitely was impacted. So I break it down. Sleep is a foundation, and then physical movement. So you don't have to be like running around all over town and, running marathons, but you do need to move your body. You need to walk, you need to like stretch. And these are things that we know as humans we've been doing for, eons, right? So it's a part of actually taking care of your physical health. And then the third is diet. So food is the number one pharmaceutical that we put into our bodies. And unfortunately, our food system does not cater to our historical biological bodies in a way that it used to. So there's a lot of chemicals, herbicides, pesticides. There's food additives that our brain is thinking that it's getting nutrients that it needs and gets excited about it. And then it's not getting this thing called the Dorito Effect. It was a book that came out. And basically what it was about was that, food companies, for understandable reasons, decided to add food additives and flavorings, and that tricks our brain to thinking that we're getting the nutrients, but we're actually getting the taste of the tomato, not the actual nutrients that come with the tomato. And so over the last several years, 70s, 80s, and 90s, what I've noticed personally and professionally, and also in terms of, doing research and reading science, is that a lot more people have issues with their gut microbiome, which directly impacts their mood and their physical health. And then the last would be rest, is actually sitting down and resting your body. So it's not sleep, it's bringing your autonomic nervous system down to the parasympathetic mode, which is, so the autonomic nervous system is broken down into two parts. We have sympathetic, which is the fight, flight, and freeze. Well, fight, flight. And then we have the parasympathetic, which is the rest, the digest, the breathing. So, I don't know too much about, how it impacts breathing, but I would imagine there has been a lot of, there's been a decrease in fertility, and I could imagine that being on this fight or flight is impacting that in many ways. So those are the 4 components of physical health that I usually talk to people about.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a million things in there. I mean, unfortunately, we've only got an hour, so we can't unpack everything, but I think there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about in particular. The sleep thing is one thing that I've really noticed, especially as I've gotten older. I work in the creative industry. I've spent a lot of time working in and out of ad agencies where we're sort of notorious for this culture of work all day, work all night, kill yourself for the job, that kind of thing. And, and there's actually, a little bit of pride in this idea that you're the one that was the last one to leave, or you're the guy that worked overnight to get this job done, or, these kinds of things. And I mean, of course, it's totally not good for you, because you're up on Red Bulls all night and you're doing all this stuff. But in the agency culture, this is something that's kind of celebrated, right? And I think maybe less so now. I think we're starting to move away from that. But that sort of Mad Men style, the reason they can make TV shows is because that was real. That's how people acted in ad agencies. And, and so I think sleep is an interesting one. And I know when I was younger and trying to get my business off the ground, I was working for an ad agency. I would work for them from like 8 in the morning to like 6 at night. And then I would run my business from 7 at night to 2 in the morning. And I did that every day for 5 years. And so including most weekends and all kinds of other things. I mean, it was pretty brutal time. But in that period of time, like, I was getting my 4 or 5 hours of sleep and I could kind of make it work. This was my 20s, maybe early 30s. And it kind of worked for me. And then at some point, I kind of hit a wall where suddenly if I wasn't getting my sleep, it just wasn't working for me anymore. Like I couldn't think, I couldn't do whatever, but there was no time because I'd built this lifestyle around, working all day and working all night. So there was no time to catch up. And for me, it just wreaked havoc on me and my health and everything else. And, I think I contribute or sort of attribute some of the extra weight that I'm carrying to that and things like that, because I just went through this really hard time. I was basically at war for 5 years. So now though, I still, I try and get a little better sleep. God, if I can race to bed by like 8:30 or 9, that's like a win for me now. But most of the time I don't actually get there. But one thing I've noticed as it pertains to sort of this COVID thing, and you made a point about how our circadian rhythms might be off a little bit, things like that during this sudden shift. I mean, like I mentioned, I've been working remotely for 20 years. And so the remote work thing isn't weird for me. And this idea of working from home or whatever, like that wasn't weird for me. And I have a lot of tricks and things that have worked for me over the years, like maintaining schedules and keeping routines and all this kind of stuff. But I have really found that during this time, even for someone who's been as disciplined about it as I have been, I feel totally lost right now. Like, even though I'm getting decent amounts of sleep, I wake up in the morning every morning like I've been hit by a truck. Like, I'm not getting good quality rest. My brain's really active at night and things like that. And I think so much of it has to do with this like sudden shift and all this external pressure,
Mm-hmm.
So,
I totally agree. Well, it's that sympathetic part of the nervous system, the fight flight. We're not good. Our brains are not good with uncertainty. And so what you'll notice is that you've taken a lot more news and not necessarily information. So, and there was so much, we were inundated with it. Oh, you have to be 6 feet away, or you can't go to the grocery store. You can't, there was so many restrictions and freedoms that were taken away in many ways. And then we did not know when it was going to end. And it just kept on kind of being prolonged. Another month, another 2 months.
Well, so even now I keep complaining that so much of my problem with things right now is just the inconsistency. Right? Like, you don't know from one store to the next store how you're going to have to, be dressed, whether it's masks or whether it's masks and gloves or whether it's eat outside or whether it's, who knows. But, but it's so different. And I think, to your point, this idea of dealing with uncertainty, we basically still kind of don't really know. So for months we've been inundated with sort of mixed information and, here's the truth of the day, but by next week it might be different. And, and it does make it really difficult to sort of, stay in a flow or keep a rhythm.
Right, because it's about safety. It doesn't feel safe and we don't know if it's going to be safe. And that takes up a lot of like biological real estate and energy. Well, biological energy and then mental real estate. So that that in and of itself, your energy is drained. It's hard to, recalibrate.
Yeah, it's funny, I don't know if it's just because we feel so far removed from animal and things like that, but, when you talk fight and flight and you talk, fear and safety and those things, I think we've gotten to a point just sort of as a society, especially here in the Western world, it's, we feel pretty darn good about things. Like, we have nice houses, we have nice cars, we're as safe as we've ever been. There's so many things going well for us right now that I think when we're thrown into a state like this, where we now have, systems that are deep in our brain that are trying to ensure that we're safe and that we're getting what we need, but the information we're collecting is inaccurate or incomplete, it does lead to a safety thing. So that's a really interesting point, this idea of sort of mental real estate. And you're kind of using up so much bandwidth just trying to stay alive, really, even though that sounds a little dramatic, but ultimately that's what your brain's trying to do. Right.
Well, but it does sound dramatic, but that is what your brain and your body's job is. And everything we do is really about trying to stay alive.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, and that's a good observation, right? Because I think we just get kind of removed from that sometimes.
Oh my gosh, yeah. We try to intellectualize all the time and rationalize things. Oh, I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't think like this, but you really can't control that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's just built into our brains, right? So the other couple things I wanted to talk about that you had touched on in this physical aspect is one of the big ones being movement, right? I think so, especially for, remote workers, freelancers, people like me, like, I mean, I'll sit in front of a computer for 13 hours a day and that's my day. And so, I mean, that's how I do my work. That's everything I do is in the machine, right? So it's just my life. And so it's very easy to slip out of a pattern of movement or a pattern of doing things. And so, and something that you said that I think is of particular interest, because I think that for a lot of people, and I think it'll sort of relate to this idea of diet and maybe even to sleep to some extent, is this idea that we don't have time to do these things, these self-care things. And it feels like we don't have time because everything feels like a big commitment, right? So like I like doing spin class, right? I don't know why, but for some reason I like spin. So I started doing spin class. But I was finding I was having to go to the gym. I was burning, getting dressed, getting ready, going to class, then afterwards showering, cleaning up, all this stuff. And it was like 2 or 3 hours, 2.5 hours out of my day. Right. And for me, when my whole day is spent in front of the computer, I can take that 2.5 hour chunk out of my day, but that means I'm working 2.5 hours later, right? So now I'm working until 9 instead of 7. And so like, that's not a free pass for me, right? And so what I found is that because of this big obligation to go do this physical work, I wouldn't go do it. It was just really easy to blow off, right? Because it was this massive commitment. But you mentioned that it's not so much about that kind of routine. It's just get up, just walk around, just do that thing. And so, so I wonder if you talk about that a little bit, just, sort of like what constitutes movement? Because for me, like my impulse is if I'm not out training for a marathon, then I'm not doing my part.
Right. Yeah. Well, look, humans have been walking for a long time. And just walking around and getting outside and walking around the block, or doing small movements, even cleaning, sweeping, mopping, like cleaning up can be movement. It's just moving your body so that it's not stagnant and staying in the same place, and that you're getting your blood flow. It is recommended that you do some vigorous like cardio type of exercise a couple of days out of the week. I mean, I know for, here in New York, we couldn't really even go outside, and it didn't even feel safe to be outside in many ways. So there was no real room to have, all the gyms were closed. Like there was no room to have like kind of and do cardio. And, you could do it in your apartment, but hey, look, again, like we talked about with energy, biological energy is being taken, and mental real estate energy is being taken. And so your body is much more likely to want to rest, as opposed to counterintuitive, as opposed to, taking the yoga class on YouTube or doing like jogging in place. It feels easier, and it is easier because you're not expending the energy, and the energy is limited in many ways. Although again, it's just like kind of, the mask, right? First, even though it's counterintuitive, you first do it for yourself, and then you end up having more energy when you have exercised.
Well, it is really interesting, sort of this, I don't know if it's an epiphany or a light's come on or what it is, but this thought, again, to this idea of safety and just sort of brain bandwidth being used up, it does sort of explain a lot of things that I'm just trying to think anecdotally in sort of my day and the things that, we're doing. Because I mean, in general, I try and avoid the news. I don't really watch the news. I try and keep my distance from a lot of the sort of social stuff that's going on in the world, just for my own mental well-being, because I'm quick to go down the rabbit hole somewhere. And so it's better for me to just try and keep a little distance. But it's interesting because, like, to your point, I mean, yes, of course it feels easier to just loaf, but I would sort of have probably attributed that to being lazy or not trying as hard or, whatever. Right? Lately I've been blaming sleep a lot, but now in context of, well, maybe your brain's working at like 110% all the time right now for survival's sake. It makes perfect sense. You'd be kind of tired and not really in the mood for stuff.
I do not believe in laziness.
Yeah, well, and I think that, it's funny because I think for many years, for a really long time, so many people put so much focus on that, right? If you weren't busting your hump, you were being lazy. And, and it's funny because like my mom never imposed that on me growing up, but I still have sort of leaned that way. And maybe it's just kind of agency life and, fast creative business. And you sort of get into this mode where if you're not hustling, then you're falling behind. And so it's sort of, so I'm kind of, I guess, a victim of sort of that hustle culture or whatever. But I do think it's interesting because, yeah, a lot of people, I've heard that opinion more lately that, laziness isn't what you think it is. It's not this idea that you're just, not doing anything or making a conscious effort to not do something. Maybe, in the context of this conversation, maybe it's got more to do with, maybe your body isn't healthy, so you're burning more resources and so you're tired. Or, maybe you're not sleeping well for one reason or another, but there's some biological cause for it. It's not that you're just not doing something. It's that your body is telling you to not do something.
Right. And I think that's the first part. That's why the physical aspect of wellness is so important, because then that leads into the second aspect of wellness, which is emotional, right? So say physically you're sleeping, you're taking care of yourself in that way, and you still feel quote unquote lazy. So then there are some other underlying, maybe unconscious core beliefs that you have about yourself. I'm not good enough. I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm going to fail. I'm worthless, which are common core beliefs, again, as a human that we all have. I mean, I read a lot about like Buddhism and mindfulness and studying different religions, and what seems to be a very common factor is that, people just don't feel like they're enough. Mm-hmm. And when you don't feel like you're enough, it's hard to put in that energy and effort to just try things, to see what would happen if you did try it. So it's kind of easier in some ways to not put in the effort and to say, well, I'm just lazy. And then again, then we have the critical voice, which is a whole nother aspect of emotional health. Yeah. Is there kind of reinforcing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and actually, if you don't mind, maybe we can dig a little bit more into those topics just as it pertains to this emotional aspect of health. I think these core three, especially, as it pertains to the other 9, I think these core 3, it makes a lot of sense to spend some time on just sort of foundationally. This idea that we're not good enough, I think, sort of permeates everything, right? I mean, I was actually just reading this morning, so it was really interesting that you brought it up, but I was just reading this morning about this person, and I'm so bad with names and book titles. I wish I could just tell you who it was. Maybe it'll sound like something you've read. But I was reading this book this morning, and they were basically making the case that, through religion and other things like this, and the parable of Adam and Eve, like for people who have sort of grown up culturally in and around those faiths that sort of start with that as the, beginning of religion, they basically taught us that from the beginning, we kind of weren't good enough. We were born with this sin, and now we must spend our whole life trying to overcome it. And what I thought was interesting about that is, when you start reflecting on your own life and school and work and business and all these different things, we spend the whole life chasing something. Right. I mean, it's as if we're trying to make up for something, but I think it's this underlying idea that we're not good enough or something, and I don't know where that comes from. Maybe you have some insights on that, but I do think it's interesting, this idea that, even if you, generally speaking, think you're good enough, you're acting in such a way that illustrates you don't really believe it.
Right. This is a really great question. I don't know if I know the answer, but thank you so much for that tidbit, because I didn't even think about that. But you're right, that Adam and Eve story is really you're born and you're not good enough. How I think of it oftentimes is, I go back to the idea of like worth, right? When you look at a baby, you don't think, oh, that baby's worth this or that, there's no like, and obviously the baby's not cognitively able to even think about that as well. But to be born, I don't know, I can't remember the statistic, but it's crazy. It's like a 1 out of a bazillion, trillion, bazillion chance. I know that's not even a number. But, your parents have had to, your parents had to have met, your grandparents had to have met, and then not even that, just the whole, like, if you believe in evolution, that whole process had to happen too. So this is huge. So the fact that you're here, the fact that I'm here, like, it matters. And if we start to feel like we're not good enough, or that something inside of ourselves isn't worthy, then, my feeling is, okay, I'm not the only one that feels like that. Everybody probably feels like that, unless you're kind of like more on the narcissistic side, like more malignant narcissist, which, they have a lot, it's a mental health issue. And they have, a disorder where they can't really empathize a lot with anybody but themselves. And, it's a challenge, because you can't tell them anything, because they really don't know. But unless you're on that, where you feel like you're 100% worthy of everything and entitled to everything, then I think most of us kind of are on the other side where we're just, just trying to struggle and feel like, I do deserve this on some level, but you don't necessarily internally feel it. And so I think if we can reframe and say, there's a reason why I'm here. I don't know. I don't even know why we're here on this planet. Like, if you think about it, it's just so crazy. We're on a rock in the middle of a universe, and you can really go down a rabbit hole, right? So I think kind of sticking with that idea is that whatever I have internally is of value. I don't know what it is. And, for me, I think probably helping people to not suffer, to help them understand themselves. I read a lot. I watch a lot of YouTube videos. I'm always trying to figure out, well, how can I put in the thoughts that I have with everything that I'm learning and what we're learning about neuroscience and what we know about psychology and from Freud, from, Carl Jung, like all of these people that have contributed immensely to humanity and continue. How can I be kind of one of those people that will continue to move the species forward? And I think that's probably the question that most people really should be kind of asking themselves, because, we all have like feelings about not feeling good enough again, but we do, if we can identify that we do have value, and each of us has something internally inside that we can move towards, like a goal or our own like personal values, and live our lives in that way, that helps to remind yourself that you are of value and that you are good enough. And just being put on this earth is
well,
amazing.
And I'll tell you a little life hack that I came up with. Maybe it won't work for everybody. It's kind of dumb, actually. It doesn't sound very profound when I tell people, but so I, have always, sort of struggled in and out with, not like diagnosed depression, but I definitely go through like dark times and good times, and, sort of ebb and flow a little bit based on what's going on in and around me. And one of the things I used to struggle with a lot was this sort of feeling of inadequacy, or that I'm not good enough, or, how come I haven't achieved more? And I noticed that it seemed to get worse sort of along with, along the lines of the growth of platforms like Instagram and things like this, where it was really easy to, see the 26-year-old with their 80-foot yacht and try and figure out, how come I'm almost 40. How did I not figure it out? At this point, I am 40. It's like, hey, and I still have, I'm nowhere near my yacht. I don't even have like a little rowboat or anything. And, so, but I think it's pretty easy to fall into this trap where you start seeing what other people are doing. You start wondering how come they've got that and I don't, and just over time it sort of compounds, right? And it starts to do this, dance on your brain where you start feeling like you're, maybe, inadequate or something. And especially for me, I've been sort of entrepreneurial my whole life, but like, I don't have these big $100 billion businesses. I don't have this kind of stuff. I can never seem to get there. I never feel smart enough, whatever it is. But the thing I started saying, and it's just this little, I don't know what it is, not really a mantra or anything, but it's kind of this frame of mind, or maybe to your point about reframing. And I was reminded of it when you were talking about just sort of how grand it is, the fact that, parents met parents, and all the way down to, sperm and egg, the fact that this worked out and we were actually born is pretty magnificent. And, but for me, I'm not particularly spiritual in that sense. I don't look back, or think of sort of this higher power approach. But for me, what I've done, and, I'm a big advocate for trying to, take responsibility for the things we've done and stuff like that. I always say that basically it took every step I've ever made to this day to get to where I am now. And it's just this concept that there was no other way for me to get to this conversation with you, Victoria, for example. I couldn't have, gone any other path. There was no straighter line that would have got me to this conversation or this particular moment. The only way to make this happen was 40 years of meandering. And for whatever reason, that sort of helps me to go, okay, then there wasn't really any wasted moments, because the only way I could have got here was this way, So, it was a long road and maybe it felt a little windy, but the only way it works out is that way. And that just sort of, it's like a little mental trick or something. But for me, it kind of gives me some pause and makes me feel a little bit better when I go, oh, okay, well, it's all just been part of this journey. And, I couldn't have, made it rich by now because this road didn't go to that, maybe we'll get there down the road, but this road got me here and this road will take me to the next thing, and so on. And so just like I say, it's a little, I don't know if it's a life hack or what it is, just some sort of positive affirmation, but it works for me. So if anybody's struggling, that's something to try.
Yeah, well, I think that's amazing. And actually, as you were talking, I was thinking immediately about therapy And, most people or many people who come to treatment, they've had some sort of trauma, whether it's a big T or a little t, like, emotional neglect, deprivation on some level of not getting what you needed as a kid and as a child, to like some really big traumas. And that's a big challenge, because it's like, you're working with people, and we all know, and I know that, look, they are so amazing where they are right now, and that they're moving forward, and their lives are going to be so much better, that they're like actually addressing all these feelings and all these traumas and all these things that have happened that have felt for them really unfair, and have been unfair, honestly. There's just so many things that we do to other humans that are just horrible, out of anger, out of fear, out of disgust, and we hurt other people. And so, helping somebody move through those feelings is the most important part of therapy. And that's why emotional health and wellness is so important, because we need to move through those emotions. Those emotions get stuck inside our bodies. We know that now with lots of research. They get stuck in our brains with obsessional thinking or rumination, things that we think about in the past. And so the work is really helping somebody to move through that with a loving, caring person in a relationship, because that's what the therapy is. And that's why this virtual stuff is so hard for me, is because, again, there's like communication happening that's not happening, like verbally. It's emotionally, it's body language, it's connecting in a very deep level. And that is the repairing, and that's the processing. And so, what I would say is, I love what you're saying. It's so true. But when somebody is in that state, like you said, where, you're comparing yourself to other people, it's hard to think that. It's hard to think that, but it's also hard to feel it. So what we do is we try to get people to actually really feel it. And it sounds like you feel it.
Yeah. And for me, like I said, it was a pretty impactful moment when I came upon this, dumb little phrase that I uttered to myself. But it did make a real tangible shift for me. Like, it did get me to a point where I wasn't all of a sudden feeling jealous, or that I've underachieved, or that I just didn't, I didn't do the right thing, or I made a bad choice somewhere along the way. It really helped me work through all that stuff. And so for me, it was really valuable. You started talking a little bit about therapy, and, I wonder if you talk a little bit about sort of, like, I think that as a society, we're taking a lot of steps in the right direction towards mental health. I think for a long time, people were kind of, sweeping stuff under rugs, or just not talking about things. I even look at people sort of like my mother's generation, and when you talk to them about going and seeing a therapist or something, it's like, nah, it's crazy talk. But it seems to be a little bit more acceptable now, and it seems to becoming more and more acceptable. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of overcoming stigma that's either, attached to things like therapy by other people, or that's sort of coming from within. So, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do we overcome these kinds of problems, where maybe we're not taking action to take care of ourselves for fear of some judgment from somebody else, that kind of thing.
Well, I like what you said. I think it's really a fear of judgment within yourself. It's not what you think about yourself. It's not what other people think about you. It's what you think other people think about you. And so, because therapy, and one of the amazing things that have happened from COVID-19, from all the movements that are happening, Black Lives Matter, is that people are recognizing that there are problems in the world that we have that have to be addressed. And so this is a foundation. And how do you address the problems? I really struggled, especially because, in New York, we had a lot of protests. And I really struggled as a therapist. I have an Instagram trying to figure out how can I be of service and what could I do? And I first had to go back to basics, which was, how do I feel? What's going on internally for me? And recognizing the complicated feelings that I have. And so, it's a challenge, because I've been in therapy for a long time, for 9 years now. And I've learned so much about myself externally, with both being in therapy and externally, because of these circumstances. And I think that has actually changed a lot of people's mind about therapy, and having a stigma about therapy. No one is okay. Like, no one's okay in all of this. Like, no matter where you are, if you didn't, no one's unscathed. So I think what this has opened up a decrease in like a stigma in mental health. And I think it's opened up a dialogue about how are you actually really doing, because no one was doing okay, especially when, you know, after the first couple of weeks and months, you know, and even now, like you said before, you know, things are popping up that one would never have imagined that they would pop up for you internally. I remember, you know, because living in New York, I've been living in New York for such a long time. Part of the reason why I love New York is that there's always people around, and being around people calmed my nervous system. I felt safe. Going outside when there was nobody outside and thinking that maybe there was somebody like lurking to hurt me was something that I had not had an experience for a really long time. So that forced me to kind of think about my own like mental health and my own wellness and some of my own childhood issues that popped up as a result.
Yeah, no, I think that makes real sense. I mean, especially, you know, you're so used to it, especially in a place like New York, you know, where it is just shoulder to shoulder all day. You know, it is, I mean, it's got to be very surreal, you know, like horror picture stuff to go outside and have there not be anyone in the streets of New York. So I can totally understand that. I also think you made an interesting point, and maybe it warrants a little bit more exploring. This idea that, you know, most of the time, and I think that this is true in a lot of circumstances, but we're making these self-judgments on the assumption that this is what we think other people think about us. When the reality is, I think most people are so wrapped up in their own business and judging themselves for their problems that they're not thinking about you at all. And so I wonder, I mean, are there, I don't know, strategies we can employ, things like that, to try and get around some of this kind of stuff where we're kind of up in our own head? You know, I mean, people accuse people of that all the time, right? Oh, you're just up in your head. You're working, you know, you're working yourself up into a lather or whatever. And I think that this idea, you know, is definitely something worth exploring, especially from the perspective of somebody who spends a lot of time working at home or working apart or is now feeling sequestered or whatever during COVID. You know, it's really easy to get caught up in our own head and our own sort of negative thought patterns and just sort of, you know, we've talked a couple times or sort of referenced this rabbit hole people can go down. And I think it's sort of maybe all related, right? This sort of self-judgment and this idea of sort of these negative thoughts and then sort of churning and all this stuff. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about sort of that phenomenon, but then also if there's some strategies we can use to work through it.
Yes. So I'll go back to the example that I used earlier for myself. Was when I went outside, I could feel my nervous system constrict and contract and feel like I had to be on alert because I wasn't feeling safe. So that was such a strong emotion for me that when I started like thinking about it, and this is a really good tip, if you have a strong emotion, if you feel hysterical, there's some sort of historical backbone to it. So then it got me thinking, okay, when did I feel unsafe? Why, in childhood, in adolescence, what were some times for me that I didn't feel like okay being in the world, or I felt this feeling of feeling constricted? And our bodies are so amazing. They really do keep the score in terms of how we're actually kind of like experiencing. And some of us are kind of in our heads and feel like numb and don't feel our sensations. So a part of the work too is understanding how your body is expressing what it's feeling. I think that's very important. So I had to kind of go back, and that's what I do with a lot of the people that I work with is like, you know, if you had, for example, you know, you had a reaction about what your boss said and you were so pissed about it and you couldn't sleep that night. There's something about what your boss said and maybe something about his personality or characteristic or something that reminds you of somebody in your past that there's like this, you know, concept called transference. So that you have transferred that strong emotion to. And of course, you know, there are, you know, bosses and like people who piss you off all the time. It's not like, you know, but when you start to recognize patterns in that, that's when, you know, okay, if it's hysterical, it's historical. You know, I wouldn't normally act like, you know, going outside, I wouldn't normally act so constricted and so kind of like, I wouldn't say paranoid, but I was definitely anxious. Paranoid is kind of like a, you know, we have the core feeling of fear, which is safe and unsafe. And then anxiety is the physical manifestations of like that not feeling safe. And then paranoia is like when your brain doesn't feel safe and starts to like, you know, the perception gets a little bit misconstrued. So I think that's a like really kind of like being self-aware about how you're feeling, both emotionally, what you're thinking, and then also what your body is communicating to you.
On that point, I think that there's really something to this idea of self-assessment. You know, as we sort of talked about at the beginning of this thing, it's funny. One of the observations that I've come across just in all the podcasting I've been doing lately and all the people I've been talking to is that no matter how much the world seems to have changed, right? The world is on its head. Everything is nuts. It's COVID, you know, everything's on fire. But the reality is that the fundamentals are sort of still true. Like the things that are important in life are still important, you know, safety, security, relationships, you know, many of these aspects that we're talking about sort of, you know, as they pertain to emotional wellness. Those things existed before. Maybe it's become more urgent that we take care of those things. Maybe we could coast before, but all of a sudden those things are brought into focus, but they were always there. And so for me, that's been a little bit of a saving grace through all this, because it gives you something to hang on to, right? It's as if your feet are planted and the world's moving around you. You know, and so I think there's this opportunity to sort of look at this. But I think for a lot of people, they get caught up, you know, they get their feet off the ground and now all of a sudden they're flying around and they don't know what to do. And so I think to get centered, you know, some of this foundational information we're talking about, I think it's really important that we do learn strategies to self-assess, and so that we can become cognizant of the voices in our head and what it is we're doing. Do you have any sort of, again, tactics or any ideas, how we can sort of find self-assessment? I mean, I know that, you know, you can take, I don't know, Instagram polls or whatever. I mean, there's stuff around, right? Personality tests and things like this. But I mean, are there tricks for sort of becoming a little bit more introspective?
Yeah. I mean, well, therapy. Yeah. and the great thing about it now is that it's remote, and I mean, in some ways it's helpful to be remote, because then it's a wider audience. You know, you can talk to somebody. So I could probably work with somebody I would never see or work with because they're even across town, you know? Mm-hmm. So that is very helpful, because what you're doing in therapy is you're just talking, and what the therapist is doing is they're paying attention to what you're saying and kind of hovering over, given your history. You know, usually we do an assessment, a psychosocial assessment about like what, you know, you've been through in like from being born. And I often talk about parents and your parents, because we also know generational trauma and generational issues that get passed on to us as we move forward in life. And sometimes we don't even know why we feel the way that we feel, but, you know, we grew up with an anxious grandmother, and then that could have impacted us. So there's so many different things. So that's why it's important to actually have like a person who's kind of objective, paying attention to what you're saying, because there are things that you're saying and patterns that you're saying that you're not so aware of. So there's that. There's also like, if you have a partner or a friend, a good friend, you know, one of the things that, you know, just to get back to safety that I've noticed is, you know, trust is a very tenuous characteristic, and a lot of people have a hard time with actually fully trusting people in many ways. And so having somebody that you trust and just asking them, like, where am I crazy? You know? Yeah. And they'll tell you, but you have to, but one thing that is, you got to be curious about it, and also having them being more like, you know, loving and curious about your behavior too is very helpful. So if you have somebody who you can really trust in that sense, that's very helpful. And I would also say, look, biologically, like there are just certain truths about how we are as humans. We have an autonomic nervous system. We have a brain that is definitely veered towards trying to make us survive and take up mental real estate about like what the future is going to be, even though none of us have any idea about the future. And I think with COVID, that aspect was just like thrown right in our face. It's like, nobody knows. This is so uncertain. And then we also, you know, have a brain that will veer towards the past and will ruminate and say, oh, I should have said this, or I should have done that, or, oh, you know, and then we all have these core beliefs about ourselves. So I think if you can if you can do those things, if just like look at yourself as like a specimen and take data without judging yourself throughout the day and your thoughts, oftentimes our thoughts are very similar every day. We think like similar thoughts every day, even though we have like a bazillion thoughts that are going through our minds. We have similar feelings. So if you could look at yourself objectively, and it's hard to do that if you don't want to go to therapy, if you don't want to ask a friend, that could be another way to build self-awareness and self-acceptance as well.
Yeah, which I think are both critical. I mean, that's definitely one of the things I'm taking away from this conversation so far. So, I've allowed us to go too far down this road, and I'm going to have to skip a bunch of my questions. There's just so many stinking things that I would love to bring up, but I think that this stuff that we've been talking about is wildly important, and I think it's very critical that we have that conversation. But I think it dovetails in really nicely to this last topic that I wanted to cover sort of in these last 10 or so minutes. And it's this idea of building resilience and sort of mental fortitude, I guess, is the way I'm describing it. So right now, as we're dealing with problems, with COVID and everything else, I mean, obviously it's unprecedented. We haven't had to deal with this before. So to have tried to prepare or be mentally ready for this might have been not doable. But I do think that there's something to this idea or this, aspect of our lives in which there's sort of a world that can be sort of imposed on us, or there's a world that we can sort of take control of. Now, granted, we can't control if a meteor is going to hit the planet or if we're going to lose our job necessarily or whatever, I mean, there's a lot of things we can't really control. But I think that this idea that I'm trying to get down to the bottom of this idea of building resilience is more about, I guess, sort of, in large part, what we've been talking about, making sure we're feeling safe and secure, being comfortable with ourselves and sort of getting to where we can actually, apply some self-care and self-love and sort of, getting to this spot where we're kind of mentally good. So then the small stuff doesn't bug us, you talked a little bit about transference and this idea that, your boss gets crappy with you or whatever. And I feel bad, sorry for my wife, because she may listen to this, but I mean, there's definitely been instances where she's jumping at me kind of irrationally. And then I hear later her complaining about something and I go, oh, wait a minute. So you weren't even like that mad at me. Like the real problem was this, but you were just trying to get it out, or I had said something that triggered that or whatever. And so this transference is a big part of that. But, maybe if we were all sort of in a better mental state, or if we had a better control over our systems, we might better be able to sort of deflect these things coming in. Mm-hmm. And so now, just sort of given this COVID world that we live in, and, there's so many people focusing on the new normal and what it's going to be, but I mean, God knows. And so if we're trying to sort of figure out how to go forward, but with strength, I guess, and I'm trying to figure out how to talk about this because I don't want to talk about it in the frame of like manliness and, flexing muscles and, I don't want to talk about it in that way, but there's still sort of this intestinal fortitude or strength of purpose or something that I think we could talk about that, there might be some skills that we could develop that it might allow us to be resilient through problems like this so that we're better able to cope, I guess.
Right.
I think there's kind of a question in there. Sorry, that was weird.
Yeah, no. I mean, I had so many thoughts as you were asking the question. So I guess, I think probably adding then the third piece of the mental health, the wellness would be spiritual. And this is where psychological flexibility comes into play. So just like physical flexibility, you stretch out, you don't just go and run a marathon because you can't. Like you have so many things that you have to work on, muscles, different mental ways of thinking about the marathon. So you have to stretch out, you have to be flexible, and you might even get injured. And if you get injured trying to run the marathon, what do? You got to pull back and rest and rejuvenate. And maybe, if you get injured too much, you can't. So you have to kind of change your goal of running the marathon. So, or if you get injured, you just take care of yourself and you continue to that goal once things are repaired. I think of psychological flexibility very similar. And so this idea of resilience is a part of that because things are going to happen. Life is constant change. It's uncertain. We just don't know what's going to happen. We're going to be in pain in some way, shape, or form. We will lose people that we love. That's just like the reality. We'll lose our job. The things that we've connected to, that we feel attached to, we will have some pain. This is just a part of being a human, right? Those are things that are just going to happen. And so the more you recognize that there's constant change, uncertainty, and that, there's going to be pain in life, the better equipped you are to say, okay, these are things that I need to accept. And with accepting these things, how can I build some psychological flexibility in when these things do end up happening? So for example, I have not really identified anything better, honestly, from the research and just from like working with the bazillion people that I've worked with, but mindfulness and meditation as a spiritual practice, in terms of recognizing that there are so many things that are outside of our control. And what mindfulness and meditation does for us, it helps us to bring our mind back to the present moment and to build that psychological flexibility. So I don't know, do you ever meditate, or have you ever done mindfulness?
I've tried, and it's really funny. So there's a practice called Yoga Nidra, and it's kind of a meditation practice.
Yes.
And I don't even know how I found it. At some point, I had a burned CD with one of these practices on it, and I remember doing it one night, and for me, it was like insane. Like, I got to this point where I was feeling like out of body and all this stuff. It was really weird, right? Super trippy. And, but really cool. Like, I was like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. And then I spent the next 6 months never able to achieve that level of sort of transcendentalness again. And then ultimately I just sort of gave up on it. And so I don't do a lot of meditation. I think I could definitely benefit from it. I'm one of these busy brain people. And so I have a really hard time settling my thoughts. And I think I could benefit from it if I could get good at it. But I think it's one of those things, and it sort of goes back to this idea of sort of self-care, taking care of sleep and making sure we're moving. It feels like it's a big commitment. So I think it's been easy for me to avoid doing it, right? Because even if it's good for me, God, I'm gonna have to do it every day. It's just one more thing on my list, pretty easy to blow off. And so, but I totally can, like I say, I had this incredible experience with this Yoga Nidra thing. And so I know it's out there and I know it exists. I do as often as I can, and I haven't been in some time now, but I really do enjoy yoga. And so I spend a lot of time doing that, and I take it with this class with all these little old women who are the most flexible people on the planet. And, so I really enjoy it, and I sort of equate the two. I feel like they kind of go hand in hand a little bit, this idea of sort of, I guess yoga gives me the opportunity to stop thinking about everything else. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'2", like 260. And for me, like, downward dog is like a bench press, right? Like, I'm lifting serious weight. So for me, it's serious exercise. But at the same time, because of the strain and the stress and like, I'm not particularly flexible, it does give me the ability to step away from the day's crap, whatever's going on. And so I guess in that sense, it is somewhat meditational. I also do, like I say, I love spin. So I have a Peloton, thank God. So I've been able to cycle throughout this pandemic. But that too, just gives me a little bit of that time. So I would say, while I don't sit down and formally meditate, sit down yoga style and meditate, I do these couple things that are a little bit of an escape. But I love the idea of meditation. And I also think too, it's one of those things that I think people kind of shy away from just for fear. I think when you start saying spiritual, it starts becoming something that people either have a feeling one way or the other against. And I think there's such a thing as being spiritual, but not being like religious, right? And so if your trepidation is with something more on a religious front than it is on a, transcendental or, within yourself kind of front, then I think, things like these spiritual practices like meditation and stuff make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Well, look, even if you don't believe in any of like spiritual stuff, one cannot deny that there is an intelligence within ourselves that gets expressed that we have no like conscious control over, like, or just looking at a mountain or a sunset, like there's some awe in that, and just seeing animals and all the different animals and bugs and all these things that really we did not create. So there's whatever it is, I don't know, I'm agnostic, so I don't know, but there is something bigger. And I think that what mindfulness does, and actually what, yoga does, and Tai Chi and Qigong, like all of those things, it just helps you to bring your mind back to the present moment so that you're not ruminating about the past and like thinking about like, oh, I should have did this, or what a loser I am, and blah, blah, blah. And you're not like concerned about the future. You're not worried about the future. Your brain's not going there. You're just bringing yourself back to the here and now and to the present moment, which is actually all we have anyways. And when you really think about it, like there's nothing going on between everything that we're doing right now is happening right now, right? Like, so when you think about it in that way, what mindfulness and meditation does, it just helps to remind your brain, oh, concentrate back on your breathing. If you do mindfulness, yoga, concentrate back on, being in downward dog and concentrating on your breathing. And, I love yoga. I do yoga every morning. And the woman I follow always says that working on the mat helps you to prepare for the world out there. So like if you're in tree pose, right? You're on one foot. You have to be stable. You have to be focused. And if you're not, some days you can do it, some days you can't. Mm-hmm. So, or you can do it on one leg, and then the next, you can't do it on the next leg. Like it's such an interesting thing about how our bodies and where our bodies are in that present moment. And I think that's building the resilience. That's building like the physical flexibility, if you think about it in yoga, but it's also psychological flexibility. And so as your thoughts and your emotions come in when you're meditating or when you're on yoga, when you're in yoga, you can say to yourself, oh, that's an interesting thought, or that's an interesting feeling that I have, and then bring yourself back to the present moment. And that helps you build psychological flexibility because you're not going with your emotions like this. Mm-hmm. You're like steady, maybe you go a little bit up, a little bit down, but there's a steadiness to it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, back to sort of the theme of this conversation of safety, building that resilience and not getting too out of whack, but sort of staying sort of close to center, mm-hmm. And again, it boils down to control and all this other stuff. We can't control what's done. We can't control what's going to be done. All we've got is this present moment. And so I think to your point, making sort of this, or building this resilience or this strength to be able to sort of find center, whatever that is, whether it's spiritual or found through yoga or physical, exercise, wherever you get it, this ability to sort of find your center and not get too caught up in where you've been and where you're headed and just kind of live in that moment, I think is really critical. So I think that's a great sort of parting shot. I mean, honestly, I've got 500 other notes here. And so we may have to circle around and revisit some other time, but in respect for your time, I'll wrap this up. So can you talk a little bit or just tell people where they can find you online, where they can chase you down if they want to get on your virtual couch or, whatever's best for you?
Yeah. So, I have an Instagram account, Wellness Psychotherapist, and every Wednesday I have a Mental Health Wellness Wednesday that I post. And it's just really information about mental health and wellness, how I think about, the world and mental health and physical health and all of the things that I'm just kind of like learning and imparting. Again, just to get back to the, being of purpose and of meaning and of worth, I figure all the information that I have in this head needs to get out and it can help a lot of people. And so I'm so grateful that, you asked me to be on your show. I really appreciate it because I really feel like these are things that people should just know. They should just know that their minds are crazy and that their bodies need to be taken care of like a little baby, and if you're not getting sleep, if you're not eating, if you're not, moving, that those things really impact you in a profound way. And it's not something that's personal. It's just how we work as humans. So my Instagram is Wellness Psychotherapist. I have a website, wellnesspsychotherapistnyc.com. And I also have a Facebook page, Wellness Psychotherapist.
Cool. And we'll be sure to share all that stuff in the links. It's funny. I was just thinking as you were sort of closing out there, it came up in one of the other conversations in this series. Depending on how this airs, people will have heard it or not. But the point was that somebody made to me, and I thought it was really interesting because it's incredibly obvious, but it's something that I think we lose sight of, is this idea that our brain and our body are sort of one. I think sometimes when we think of mental health, we think of our brain being sort of this autonomous creature that's running around and doing its thing, and it's bumming out, it's having hard mental health days or whatever. Our body, however, it's totally irrelevant. The body might be fine, whatever, it's doing its thing. And so, but I think this idea that they're somehow separate instead of being merged into one thing, and that mental health is a brain problem, not a whole body problem, I think is really interesting. And so I think, it's just interesting that you brought that up as well, that sort of, throughout this discussion, as we're talking about safety and health and over, being, maintaining physical and emotional and all these different levels of mental wellness, it really is about this whole system. It's about our whole body. It's not really about this just, fixing our brains or whatever. And so I just thought that was kind of an interesting observation. It seemed like apropos to bring it up before we get out of here.
Yeah. Yep.
So cool. Well, thank you so much, Victoria. I really appreciate your time. This was awesome. And like I say, I could have gone all day with you. So I'm really grateful for the time that you were able to whittle out for us. And, stay safe and everything out there in New York.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know